Okay, in this video, I'm going to walk you through an example, a hypothetical example of what we expect when we're looking at a two-gene cross, but one of our genes is X-linked and the other gene is autosomal, okay? So this might be relevant to what you're hypothesizing for the Drosophila lab, right? But here I'm just going to use two hypothetical genes. We'll have gene A, we are hypothesizing as X-linked, and gene B, we are hypothesizing is autosomal. And so the notation we're going to use reflects that inheritance, right? For the A gene, we're using X as our base symbol because we're saying that the gene is X-linked. And then we denote the specific allele at that gene with a superscript. So we have an X with a big A superscript for the dominant allele, an X with a little a superscript for the recessive allele. Okay, gene B we're saying is autosomal, so we're just going to use a B symbol for that. Again, big B for the dominant allele, little b for the recessive allele. Okay, so let's look at our parental generation. Okay, and in the parental generation, we have a dominant allele at one sex, okay, and I'm going to set this up so that we have the dominant allele in the males, okay, and so we have an X big A and a Y in the males, okay, and we'll put that with a dominant B genotype as well. So these pure breeding males are going to be actually hemizygous at the X-linked gene. They just carry one allele and express whatever that allele is. And then they are pure breeding, so they're homozygous at the B gene. Okay, we're going to mate these with recessive females at both genes. Okay, so the female is going to have two X chromosomes, and they both have a little a allele on them. And then the female also has a homozygous recessive at the B gene. Okay, so let's see what we get in the F1s. And remember, we want to track both genotypes and phenotypes, right? So we want to use the genotypes to predict what our phenotypic ratios are. Okay, now we are specifically, as part of this hypothesis, we're saying that these genes are on different chromosomes, right? Gene A is on the X chromosome, gene B is on an autosome. So these genes, by our hypothesis, are independently assorting, and so we can look separately at the X-linked A cross and then separately consider the autosomal B cross and then combine those results, okay? So let's use a Punnett square here to figure out what we're going to get in the F1. Okay, now I'm going to minimize this a little bit. Okay, and give myself a little bit more room to the side to make some Punnett squares. Okay, so let's take the X-linked A gene first. In our Punnett square, we have the chromosomes that could be coming from the male. I'll put those down the side. So we have an X with a big A allele or a Y chromosome. Across the top, I'm going to put the alleles that could be coming from the female parent. So those would be an X chromosome, and this female's homozygous for the recessive allele. Okay? Now, let's combine these alleles coming from each parent, right? So in this upper square, we could have a big A from the father with a little a from the mother, or moving over, we could get, again, a big A from the father combined with a little a from the mother, okay? On the other hand, in this bottom row, we could get a little a from the mother with a Y from the father, right? And again, in this last square, we would get the same result, okay? So these two cells are both female offspring. These two cells are both male offspring, right? And so the females are heterozygous in both cases, right? And so the females are going to be a dominant phenotype. Okay? The males are both, in both cases, we could get a recessive X combined with a Y. right? So the males are going to express the recessive little a phenotype, okay? And of the total offspring, half should be dominant expressing females and half should be recessive expressing males, okay? Now let's look at that B gene, okay? And we actually, from one parent, we're going to get a big B allele. From the other parent, we're going to get a little B allele. So there's only one possible genotypic outcome, right? Heterozygous F1s. And this would be a dominant phenotype. Okay? So we could have F1 females that are heterozygous in their genotype at the X locus, at the X-linked locus, I should say. Okay? And we combine that with the heterozygous genotype at the B locus. Okay? So our F1 females should all be heterozygous at both of these loci, right? Their phenotype will be dominant for A and dominant for B. Okay? The males, the F1 males, are getting a recessive allele at the X-linked A locus from their mothers and a Y chromosome from their fathers. And then at the B gene, they're also heterozygous, right? So the males should be recessive at the A trait and dominant at the B trait, okay? And the fact that we have these phenotypic outcomes that are different between males and females tells us that that A gene is sex-linked, is X-linked, actually. Okay? Now, the next step that we take is we're going to cross these fully heterozygous females with males that are recessive at the X-linked allele and heterozygous at the autosomal gene. Okay? And the outcome of that cross gives us our F2. Okay? Now, let's again consider what's going on at the A gene separately from what's going on at the B gene. Okay? And we're going to use Punnett squares again, just so it's really clear to everybody. Okay? So let's take the A gene again. I'm going to put the alleles coming from the male down the side. So in this case, we have a little a on that male's X, and the other chromosome would be a Y chromosome. Okay? From the female, the F1 females are heterozygous, right? So we have a big A allele on the one X chromosome and a little a allele on the other X chromosome. Okay, so let's see what we get in these outcomes. We could get a female here with a big A on one chromosome and a little a on the other chromosome. In this upper right corner, we get, again, 2X chromosomes, so female. But in this case, we're inheriting a little a allele from both parents, right? So homozygous recessive female. Then moving down to the lower left, we have a male, X and Y, okay? And that X coming from the F1 female has a big A allele on it, okay? Then our last outcome would be, again, an X and a Y chromosome, so a male, and we have a little a on that X chromosome. Okay, so we have these two outcomes give us, again, females. These two outcomes, this bottom row, show us all the F2 males, right? But within those females, we have dominant and recessive represented, right? In those males, we have both dominant and recessive phenotypes, okay? So overall, we have half of the F2s would have a dominant big A phenotype, and that includes both females and males, okay? The other half of the F2 offspring would have a recessive little a phenotype, and again, that includes both females and males equally, okay? So that's one gene. Now, let's make a little bit more room here and consider the other gene, right? With the B gene, we're looking at a monohybrid cross. Both of the F1s are heterozygous. So we can again make up a little Punnett square, okay? And so the alleles from one parent would be a big B versus a little b. The alleles coming from the other parent would be a big B versus a little b. Okay, and we can really quickly combine these alleles. We get a homozygous dominant in one case, a heterozygous in another case, another instance of getting a heterozygote, and then finally we have homozygous recessive. Okay, so the phenotypic ratio that we would expect here would be 3/4 have a dominant phenotype and 1/4 would have the recessive phenotype. Okay, and sex doesn't matter here with this B gene because we're saying it's autosomal. Okay, so we've got phenotypic outcomes for one gene. We've got phenotypic outcomes for another gene. Now what we need to do is combine these. And I think the easiest way to do that is to use a branching diagram. Okay, so let's say we have first our A outcomes listed. Half of the offspring would have, actually, let me use the right notation here, okay? Half of the outcome would have at least one, or just one, big A allele, okay? The other chromosome could be an X chromosome with a little a allele, or it could be a Y chromosome, okay? And so basically half of the outcomes are going to have a dominant A phenotype, and that includes, again, both females and males. The other half of the offspring would have a recessive A phenotype, and as you can see up here, that includes both females and males. So it could be two X's both carrying a little a allele, or it could be one X with a little a allele combined with a Y. Okay? Now, both of these A gene outcomes could combine with either possibility at the B gene, right? 3/4 would have the dominant phenotype. 1/4 would have the recessive B phenotype. Okay? Again, we could combine the recessive A outcome with both of our B gene outcomes, right? 3/4 would have a dominant phenotype at B. 1/4 would have the recessive phenotype at B. And so across all these branches, we get all possible outcomes across our two gene, or our two trait phenotype. Okay, so we're going to combine these, right? Let me give myself a little bit more room here. Okay, and we're going to combine our phenotypic notations, really. Okay, so X big A and at least one big B allele, right? So these individuals would have a dominant A phenotype and a dominant B phenotype. To get the probabilities, you multiply across 1/2 and 3/4 here, so that would be 3/8. Okay? Moving on down, here we have this possibility would combine a dominant A phenotype with a recessive B phenotype. Okay, and that would be 1/2 times 1/4, or 1/8. Okay? The third outcome here would combine a recessive A outcome with a dominant B phenotype. Actually, I should put a little line there, okay? And that would be 1/2 times 3/4, or 3/8. Okay? And finally, we have a recessive phenotype at both of our genes, right? Recessive at A, recessive at B, and that would be 1/2 times 1/4, or 1/8. Okay? Now, you can see, if we go back to these A phenotypic outcomes here, for each of the dominant A, we expect males and females equally represented in that phenotype. For each of these recessive A outcomes, we expect females and males equally represented in that phenotypic category. So that would actually carry through this branching diagram. In each of these 4 phenotypic outcomes, we would expect to include both sexes equally. Okay, So females and males. Okay, so again, this is what we expect in the F1s here and in the F2s here if gene A is X-linked and gene B is autosomal. Okay, now I didn't explicitly state it in this hypothesis, but I also assumed that the males started out with the dominant phenotypes and the females started out with the recessive phenotypes. Okay, I'll let you see how this would change if we mix that up, right? If the female phenotype actually, female parentals started off with the dominant traits and the males started off with the recessives, or if the if each sex in the parental generation had one dominant trait and one recessive trait, right? Those are all different ways you can mix it up, but basically you want to go through the same procedure to see what do you expect in the F1s and then what do you expect in the F2s.